Mr. President, today is Earth Day, and so I wanted to come to the floor and reflect on some of the changes that our Earth is experiencing, and to talk at some length about how those changes are affecting my home state of Delaware, and how the Delaware community is studying, planning, and preparing to deal with these important changes. The recent National Climate Assessment has said that the last decade in the United States was the hottest on record, and that the last year was the hottest year ever recorded through the United States government. We're waking up, Mr. President, to fewer mornings with frost on our windshields, to less snow cover, to warmer oceans and freshwater sources, to more frequent and intense storms, to heat waves, to floods and droughts. And these many changes are affecting human health, agriculture, transportation, our water supply, our ecosystems, wildlife, and many other aspects of our daily lives and our American heritage. On top of all this, we are seeing higher water levels in our oceans and estuaries, including in and around my home state of Delaware. Sea level rises essentially for two different reasons. First, as the planet's ice sheets are melting, they're adding to the amount of water in the ocean. But second, salt water actually expands as it warms. So as the planet's average temperature rises, so does the level of its saltwater seas. The fact that Earth's oceans are rising each year isn't new information. It's been rising for as long as we've been keeping track. What's really jarring, though, is that the rate of rise is increasing steadily and significantly. When the data was tracked between 1870 and 1930, sea level was rising at a rate of just under 4 inches per 100 years. Over the next 60 years, sea level rose at a doubled rate of 8 inches per 100 years. And then just over the last 20 years, sea level's been rising at a rate of more than 12 inches per 100 years. The water is rising, Mr. President, and for those of us from coastal states, and in particular for those of us in Delaware, it's rising fast. At just 60 feet, Delaware actually has the lowest mean elevation of any state in the United States, already making it more susceptible to sea level rise. But here's the thing, we also have another challenge in that the land itself is also sinking. There's a documented vertical movement of the Earth's crust underneath the mid-Atlantic coast, referred to as subsidence. And it's been happening in Delaware since the last ice age at a pace of roughly 2 millimeters every year. I know 2 millimeters doesn't sound like much, but it adds up to another 4 inches per century. In total, Mr. President, that means you've got between the water rising and the land sinking, making climate change and sea level rise specifically a very real issue for my state and for many other coastal states. An array of scientists of many different disciplines and backgrounds have studied this in and outside of the United States government, and they've developed 3 models for future scenarios. In the most conservative model, by the year 2100, the sea level in Delaware will rise about 0.5 meters, or about 1.5 feet. In another middle range model, the water in Delaware will rise by a full meter. And in the most troubling model, it'll rise 1.5 meters, or about 5 feet, between now and the end of this century. And unfortunately, at present, the scientific consensus, their shared estimate, is that this is the most likely model. Well, let's try and make that real, as we have in Delaware through a whole series of planning exercises to engage our coastal communities. Here's what these different projections look like in Bowers Beach, Delaware. It only takes 0.5 meter of sea level rise, shown here, before much of this community close to Dover Air Force Base in Kent County, Delaware, is underwater. 0.5 meter, the most conservative scenario, and by the end of the century, the majority of this community is underwater. At 1.5 meters, the most likely scenario in current estimates, the town is virtually gone. Here's another chart, which we've shared with our communities in Delaware of sea level rise. It's a look at South Wilmington. The city of Wilmington, where I live, is very close to the Delaware River and has a whole lot of low-lying areas. This is part of the largest city in our state. And as water rises in the Atlantic, it also rises up the Delaware Bay and the Delaware River and the Christina River, which runs through most of Newcastle County and through this part of Wilmington. The water rises through the Peterson Wildlife Refuge as well, and the impacts are devastating. We're talking about water more than 1.5 feet higher than what Delaware experienced during Superstorm Sandy every day. You can see from the conservative to the moderate to the most likely scenario, it floods, it impacts, and it eliminates, wipes out, puts underwater most of South Wilmington. The calculation of whether we're going to be hit with a half a meter, a full meter, or a meter and a half of sea level rise comes down to a question of the rate of acceleration of climate change globally. And it's also implicated in the question of whether we should be trying to slow the rate at which climate change is affecting our planet and maybe even have some hope of turning the tide. This is the part of climate change policy known as mitigation. Priority one in this strategy is reducing, cutting the emissions we're pumping into our atmosphere that are driving this change. To do it, we need to diversify our energy sources and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Clean energy technology, energy efficiency programs, public transportation, recycling, and many other things could help cut down on these emissions. But it will require a global and coordinated effort to avoid or minimize these projected devastating local impacts. The second part of climate change policy is adaptation. It's based on accepting the reality our climate is changing and that it will have real effects on our planet and our communities. The truth is that even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, if we shut down our current power plants, stopped driving our current automobiles, stopped drilling and using gas-powered equipment on our farms, for trains, for ships, the amount of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere would still take decades to dissipate. Changes in the world's climate are at this point inevitable. It's already happening and affecting our communities, and we can expect these impacts to intensify and accelerate as climate continues to change. In my view, we need to accept these facts and modify our behavior to prevent these effects from becoming cumulatively catastrophic. We can make better choices now to prevent a disaster later. In Delaware, for example, we've had 2 laws on the books for decades that have helped us to adapt. The first law, championed in 1971 by then Republican Governor Russ Peterson, was called the Coastal Zone Act and prohibited future industrial development on a vital swath of coastal lands, allowing the state and federal government to preserve it and to reduce the impacts of flooding and coastal erosion on these vital wetland areas. Second law empowered our state to protect and replenish the state's beaches, including beaches on the Delaware Bay, which are so often overlooked. This has allowed the state to build a series of berm and dune systems that protects infrastructure and prevents private property from being washed away. Instead of running away from the science, Delaware's leaders have embraced it. The state agency that manages environmental issues for Delaware is known as DENREC. And under Secretary Colin O'Mara's able leadership, it's taken the lead on a government-wide project to assess our state's vulnerability to sea level rise and to recommend actions for adaptation. In fact, Delaware's Sea Level Rise Advisory Committee, whose report I have here, spent 18 months looking at 79 different statewide resources, vital things, roads and bridges, fire stations, schools, tourist hotspots, wetlands, and of course, our people, their homes, their businesses, and layered them on various maps, as I've shown, that demonstrated how far the water would reach at different projected sea levels. If sea level gets to 1.5 meters, we lose more than 10% of our state. The water claims 20,000 residential properties and significant percentages of the state's parks and wetlands, farms, highways, industrial sites, rail lines. In Delaware, we could lose 21 miles of rail lines to flooding, effectively shutting down Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. The vital port of Wilmington would be rendered useless on its current footprint. Nearly all the state's acreage of protected wetlands would be inundated and destroyed. Nearly 3/4 of the state's dams, dikes, and levees that we use to hold back the bay would be flooded. It would be simply devastating to our state. So to those who say, oh, a few feet of water rising over a century is a modest amount, something that we can plan for, something that we don't need to be alarmed about, I think this detailed and thorough study demonstrates the devastating consequences to my home state, a state that would lose 11% of its territory in the worst case scenario. Our own Secretary of Natural Resources, Colin O'Mara, has said, and I quote, "We're looking at big risks to human health and safety, and not just at the Delaware Bay beaches. We have big concerns about South Wilmington, Delaware City, Newcastle. It is more complex than just the Bay beaches or a few coastal communities here and there." Mr. President, I believe he's right. And so once again, if we remember, we have two basic approaches, adaptation and mitigation. Once Delaware compiled its 200-page vulnerability assessment on sea level rise, the committee got to work on an adaptation strategy to protect our state. It came up with more than 60 options and released them publicly, hosting a whole series of town hall meetings to solicit public opinion before the state decides which strategies to implement. The committee is also now working on a broader vulnerability assessment to examine the full range of impacts from climate change, beyond sea level rise, how changing temperatures, extreme weather, changes in precipitation might affect even more of our neighbors and our citizens. Climate change will affect the distribution, abundance, and behavior of wildlife, as well as the diversity, structure, and function of our complex ecosystems. We're already seeing changes to these natural patterns. Commercial and recreational fish stocks along the East Coast have moved northward 25 to 200 miles over the last 40 years as ocean temperatures have steadily but modestly increased, deeply impacting our fishing industries and our fishing-reliant communities. Scientists expect migratory species to be strongly affected by climate change, since animal migration is closely connected to climatic factors and migratory species use multiple habitats and resources during their migrations. These changes are impacting the multi-billion-dollar waterfowl hunting industry, vital to my state, an important economic driver to Delaware, and a vital part of our heritage. According to the National Climate Assessment released in January, our farmers are expected to adapt relatively well to the changing climate over the next 25 years, but later, as temperatures increase and precipitation extremes get more intense, crop yields and the production of livestock and poultry are expected to decline. More extreme weather events, including droughts and heavy downpours, will further reduce yields, damage soil, stress irrigation water supplies, and increase production costs. Mr. President, I'm proud of my state. I'm proud that Delaware was the first state to assess its vulnerability and the vulnerability of specific resources in as comprehensive a way as it has. We're determined to confront these changes to our planet head-on and to protect our own communities, to protect the way of life we've built. It's an approach that many other states, I hope, will replicate. The private sector also has a vital role to play, and they're not waiting around for action in this chamber or by the federal government. We're seeing a lot of our companies already taking steps on their own to be more sustainable. I see this all the time at home when I visit companies in Delaware, from Phillips and Kraft to DuPont, Purdue, and Mount Air. This chamber may still be debating climate change and whether it's real and what, if anything, we should do about it. But these companies, like our communities, like our state, aren't. They're reducing their water use, reducing their power consumption, slimming their footprint, finding ways to be more energy efficient, not just because it's good for the planet, but because it's good for their bottom line. Reducing their operating costs, they've learned, in measurable ways, is good for business and it's good for the planet. But frankly, there's only so much the federal government can do as far as adapting to climate change. But it still plays a very important role that, frankly, states and the private sector alone cannot play. The federal government can ensure states have accurate data on climate trends over the long term on which to base these assessments. Invest in things like the tidal gauges that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, maintains off all our coasts, which are critical to monitoring sea level rise and supporting the satellites overhead which track changing weather patterns. The federal government facilitates technology transfer and information sharing, provides technical assistance and guidance to states and regions like ours, and initiates collaboration and coordination among partners that's essential. From the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, to the CDC's grant program to help state and local health departments assess risks, the federal government is doing a lot. But given the scope and the dire consequences, we need to do more. This president and this administration seem to get it, but what role can and should Congress play? In my view, we need to also lead in the area of mitigation, supporting the executive branch as they continue to help states with adaptation. We need to invest wisely in our efforts to combat and prepare for climate change. I've been a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee for more than 2 years now, and we've seen some ambitious plans to do just that, to do our part in mitigation, many of which I've supported, like the proposal from Senator Bingaman, former chair of the Energy Committee in the last Congress, to adopt a clean energy standard. It would set a national goal for clean energy usage and establish a transparent framework that lets resources compete based on how clean they are and then gets out of the way and lets the market and American ingenuity determine the best path forward. Sadly, this plan failed to attract any bipartisan support and never made it out of committee. Mr. President, although an idealist, I'm also a pragmatist, and I can read the politics of this chamber. They're deeply divided on this issue at a time when we need to be coming together. Fortunately, there is bipartisan support for some steps to improve our nation's energy efficiency. We could take up and pass the bipartisan bill recently introduced by our colleagues, Senators Shaheen and Portman, to increase the use of energy-efficient technologies in residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. Or we could level the playing field for financing and help new clean energy technologies get off the ground by giving them access to the same tax advantages currently utilized only by fossil fuel projects. The bipartisan Master Limited Partnerships Parity Act, which I'll reintroduce with my bipartisan group of colleagues, Senators Moran and Murkowski, as well as Stabenow, later this week, would level the playing field for renewables and give these new technologies a fighting chance in the emerging energy market. As we take these sorts of steps and others, we must also be mindful of the need to reduce our nation's dangerous deficits. But we also need to make sure we're not taking away the tools we desperately need to prepare for these changes to our planet. That means sustained support for scientific research and protecting the programs that are channeling this vital data to our states. The bottom line, in my view, is that climate is already changing. We know that. With this knowledge comes the responsibility to reduce our emissions, to mitigate the impacts, and to prepare for and take action with regards to these coming changes. Climate change is happening, Mr. President. It's happening right now. And while it may have local impacts, it has global causes, and we ignore these at our peril. I believe we have a responsibility to God's creation, a responsibility to each other, a responsibility to our home states and to future generations, to do our very best to slow this process, to help this planet, our only home, to survive.